Brittany said it right in front of me. Not in a whisper, not when she thought I'd stepped out of the room. She said it standing in the middle of my son's living room, holding a glass of white wine, wearing that bright smile she reserves for people she wants to impress. And she said it loud enough for everyone at that dinner table to hear. Oh, we don't need to worry Jane with the financial details. She's from a different generation. These things can be confusing. I was sitting 4 feet away from her. I had my tea. I had my reading glasses resting on the arm of the chair. I was wearing my favorite cardigan, the soft gray one with the small buttons that Harold always said made me look like someone's gentle grandmother. I let her finish. I took a slow sip of my tea, and I thought to myself, Brittany, I spent 35 years making financial decisions that kept 300 people employed. I've sat across from bank presidents and made them blink first. I know exactly what you're planning, and I have been waiting, very patiently, for you to show me just how far you're willing to go. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just smiled and asked if anyone wanted more cornbread. They spent 3 years looking past me. I used that time well. My name is Jane Washington. I am 68 years old. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1956, the second of 4 children, in a household where money was discussed honestly and respected deeply, because we didn't have enough of it to take for granted. My mother cleaned houses for other families during the week. My father worked at the steel plant and sang in the church choir on Sundays. They were not wealthy people, but they were intentional people. And there is a difference that most folks never understand until it's too late. My mother used to sit at the kitchen table on Friday nights with her envelope system. 1 envelope for rent, 1 for groceries, 1 for church, 1 for what she called the quiet account. I asked her once what the quiet account was for. She looked at me with those steady brown eyes of hers and said, Baby, the quiet account is for the day when somebody tries to take something from you. You want to have something left over to fight back with. I was 9 years old. I never forgot it. I was the first person in my family to go to college. A full scholarship to Spelman College in Atlanta, 1974. I studied accounting because numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes didn't. Numbers don't lie to your face. Numbers don't smile at you in public and scheme against you in private. Numbers are honest if you know how to read them. I went on to get my MBA. I worked my way up through 3 different companies over 15 years, taking roles that challenged me, learning every corner of corporate finance, earning a reputation as someone who could walk into a failing budget situation and find the problem within 48 hours. In 1991, I became the Chief Financial Officer of Hargrove Real Estate Holdings, a regional development company with assets across 6 southeastern states. I was 40 years old. I was one of the very few Black women holding that title anywhere in the country at that time. I knew what it cost me to get there, and I knew what it meant to hold it. I retired at 63 after Harold got sick. Some things matter more than titles. Harold Washington was my husband for 41 years. He was a high school history teacher who made students cry, not from fear, but from the weight of truth. He taught them about people who had been overlooked, undercounted, and underestimated. And he taught them that history had a way of correcting itself, slowly and then all at once. Harold died of pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday morning in October 5 years ago. He held my hand, told me I was the smartest person he'd ever known, and asked me to make sure the grandchildren knew his name. I promised him I would. He left everything to me. Not because he didn't trust our children. He loved Derek and Renee with his whole heart. He left everything to me because he knew that I would think clearly when emotions ran hot. He knew that I would protect what needed protecting and release what needed to be let go. That was Harold. He always knew exactly who I was, even when I was wearing the gray cardigan and offering people cornbread. Here is what Brittany saw when she looked at me. She saw a 68-year-old woman who wore comfortable shoes and kept hard candy in her purse. She saw someone who moved a little slowly in the mornings and occasionally asked for help reading small print on restaurant menus. She saw a woman who talked about Harold in the past tense and teared up at church sometimes, and brought sweet potato pie to every family gathering without being asked. She saw a grandmother. She did not see the woman behind the grandmother. And that was entirely by design. When Harold passed, I made a deliberate decision. I had spent 35 years in rooms where people were performing their power every single day. Expensive suits, corner offices, firm handshakes, names dropped like calling cards. I was exhausted by all of it. I wanted the last chapter of my life to be lived quietly, for the people who actually mattered, without the performance. So I stopped performing. I drove my old Buick even though I could have bought something newer. I shopped at the same grocery store I'd been shopping at for 20 years. I wore clothes that were comfortable and clean and unremarkable. I let my hair go gray naturally, and it came in beautifully, I might add, a full silver that Dorothy says makes me look distinguished. I call it Tuesday. My house in Atlanta is modest from the outside. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a garden that Harold started, and I've kept going. What you wouldn't know from the street is that the back bedroom, the one Brittany assumed was full of old boxes and fabric remnants, is where I keep my office. Dual monitors, files organized by year going back 2 decades, a whiteboard, a locked file cabinet that Thomas Abernathy and I update every 6 months. Thomas has been my financial advisor and attorney for 25 years. He is 60 years old, meticulous beyond description, and completely unimpressed by people who try to use charm or pressure to get what they want. Harold called him the human firewall. Thomas found that very funny. He is the only person outside my family who knows the full picture of what I have and how it's structured. And then there is Dorothy Freeman, Dot, as I've called her since 1984. We met at a professional women's conference in Charlotte. She was a young attorney. I was a rising finance manager. We sat next to each other at a luncheon, disagreed about something within the first 10 minutes, and have been best friends ever since. Dot spent 22 years as a family court judge. She has seen, as she puts it, every flavor of human foolishness that money can produce. She retired 6 years ago and now spends her time gardening, traveling, and being right about things, which she does with a frequency that I find both admirable and occasionally exhausting. Dot knew about Harold's illness before most of our family did. She sat with me in the hospital during the last weeks. She was the first person I called after he passed. And she was the first person I called when I began to understand what Brittany was quietly building inside my son's household. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. Derek is my son. He is 43 years old. He is a civil engineer, a good father, and at his core, a decent man. I did not raise a dishonest person. I raised a person who, somewhere along the way, became so devoted to keeping peace in his marriage that he forgot what it cost him, and the people around him, to maintain that peace at any price. I watched it happen slowly. That's the thing about gradual change. It's nearly invisible until the accumulation becomes undeniable. 7 years ago, when Derek married Brittany, I was genuinely happy for them. Brittany was sharp, organized, and clearly in love with my son. She had opinions, which I respected. She had plans, which I understood. I gave them $40,000 toward their wedding without being asked, because I wanted them to start their life together with joy rather than debt. Looking back, I think that gift established a dynamic that I didn't intend and should have recognized sooner. For the first 2 years of their marriage, I had a warm relationship with both of them. I helped with Caleb's childcare when he was born, not just financially but physically, showing up 2 days a week so Brittany could return to work without the full crushing weight of infant logistics. I was present. I was useful. I was, as far as I understood, welcomed. Then Zoe arrived and Brittany decided to stop working. Their income dropped. I helped more. Groceries during tight months, a medical bill here and there, a family vacation one summer when Derek mentioned they hadn't had one in 3 years. I never kept a ledger. I never made them feel the weight of it. It was family. That's what family does when it can. But something shifted. I first noticed it in the way Brittany spoke to me at family dinners. There was a new tone, not rude exactly, but subtly dismissive. The way she'd redirect a conversation when I was mid-sentence. The way she'd answer questions directed at me before I had a chance to respond. Little things, individually explainable, but collectively adding up to something unmistakable. Then came the rules. I had to call ahead at least 3 days before visiting. Showing up without notice, even with gifts, even at Caleb's explicit invitation, was inconsiderate of our schedule. I was not to give the children food that wasn't on their approved list. I was not to discuss certain topics, school, discipline, bedtime, because Brittany had a system and outside input confused the children. I followed the rules, not because I agreed with them, but because I understood that my access to Caleb and Zoe was now a conditional resource, and Brittany held the conditions. Renee saw it before I was ready to say it out loud. My daughter is 46 years old, and she has exactly 0 patience for pretense. She is a pediatric surgeon in Houston. Brilliant, direct, and constitutionally unable to watch something wrong happen without naming it. Her son Jordan is 10. She calls me every Sunday without fail. About 2 years ago, Renee said to me on one of those calls, "Mama, Brittany is isolating Derek. I don't know if he sees it, but she's cutting him off from everyone who knew him before her. Calvin can't get a call returned. You're working around a schedule she designed, and Derek just goes along with all of it." I told her I was watching, that I hadn't drawn any conclusions yet. She said, "You're always watching, Mama. At some point, watching becomes a choice too." She wasn't wrong. But I also knew something Renee didn't yet. The watching had a purpose, because I had already started to hear things, small things, fragments of conversations, that told me the situation was moving towards something specific, something financial. Let me tell you about 3 moments that I carry with me, not because they were the worst things that happened, but because they were the clearest. Sometimes clarity arrives in small packages. The first moment happened at a Sunday dinner about 18 months ago. Brittany had invited her sister and brother-in-law over, along with 2 couples from their neighborhood. It was a lively evening. Good food, good conversation, the kind of gathering that looks like family harmony from the outside. At some point, Brittany's brother-in-law asked about real estate investments, whether now was a good time to buy rental property given the rate environment. It was a reasonable question, and it happened to be a question I had spent a significant portion of my professional life thinking about. I opened my mouth to answer. Brittany laughed lightly and said, "Oh, we'll have to ask someone who keeps up with those things. Jane, you want some more sweet tea, hun?" The conversation moved on. I sat with my glass of sweet tea and I thought, she did not ask me to be quiet. She simply made it so that my voice did not exist in that room. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not announce itself. It simply redirects traffic until you are standing on a road that leads nowhere. I smiled. I said yes to the sweet tea. I made a note when I got home. The second moment happened 6 months later in Derek's kitchen while I was visiting on a scheduled and pre-approved Tuesday afternoon. Brittany didn't know I had arrived early. Caleb had called my cell phone from his little tablet, which he was technically not supposed to do, and asked if I could come see his science project before it was due. I came. I should have knocked louder. I heard Brittany's voice from the kitchen before I reached the doorway. She was on the phone. The words I caught were these: "Before she's not capable of making those decisions anymore. We just need to move before that window closes, okay? Derek is going to handle it." She heard me come in a moment later and the call ended immediately. She greeted me with her usual warmth. "Jane, what a nice surprise," and nothing in her face acknowledged what I had just heard. I played with Caleb and his science project for 2 hours. I ate a snack. I said goodbye. In my car in the driveway, I sat for a full 5 minutes before starting the engine. Then I drove home, walked into my office, sat down at my desk, and opened a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it with a date. I began to document. The third moment was the one that told me everything I needed to know about my son. 3 months before Caleb's birthday party, Derek came to my house alone. He seemed uncomfortable from the moment he walked in, unable to quite meet my eyes, shifting his weight the way he used to do as a teenager when he had something difficult to say. He asked about the trust funds. He said it was just curiosity. He wanted to understand the structure, how the accounts were set up, who had access, what the conditions were for early withdrawal. He framed it casually, as a father wanting to be informed about his children's financial future. I answered him honestly and simply. The accounts were structured as discretionary trusts. I was the sole trustee. The funds were designated for Caleb and Zoe when they turned 25. Early release was possible only for specific qualifying events, medical emergencies, post-secondary education, and required my written approval. Derek nodded slowly. Then he said, "And there's no way for us as parents to have any role in managing them before then?" I looked at my son. I kept my voice completely level. "The trusts were designed exactly as I intended them to be designed, Derek. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" He said no. He said he was just asking. He stayed for dinner, was quieter than usual, and left before 8 o'clock. I called Thomas Abernathy the next morning, not to freeze anything yet, just to tell him, "Thomas, I need you to make sure all 3 accounts are fully current and that the protective language is as tight as it can possibly be. Something is coming and I want to be prepared." Thomas didn't ask me to explain further. 25 years of working together means that when I call with that particular tone in my voice, he simply says, "I'll have everything reviewed and updated by end of week." That was 3 months before Caleb's birthday party. That was 3 months before Brittany looked me in the eye in that kitchen and told me, calmly and with complete confidence, that the trust funds belonged to them now. She thought she was telling me something I couldn't stop. She didn't know I'd been preparing for this conversation for 18 months. And she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. There is a photograph on my office wall that most people never see. It was taken in October of 1991, the day I was officially named CFO of Hargrove Real Estate Holdings. I am standing at the head of a conference table in a room full of men in expensive suits. I am 40 years old. I am wearing a burgundy blazer that I saved 2 months to buy. And I am smiling the way you smile when you have worked 15 years for a moment and you refuse to let anyone see how much it cost you to get there. Harold took that photograph. He drove 4 hours from Atlanta to Charlotte to be in the building that day. He sat in the lobby the entire time because he wasn't allowed in the boardroom. When I came out, he stood up, looked at me, and said, "There she is." Just that. There she is. I have never taken that photograph down. I tell you about it because I want you to understand something before I explain what happened next. I am not a woman who stumbled into financial security. I did not inherit a fortune or marry into one. Harold was a high school teacher. We were comfortable because we were disciplined, because we saved aggressively, invested consistently, and never once confused what we wanted right now with what we were building for later. By the time I retired at 63, Harold and I had accumulated a portfolio that reflected 40 years of careful, deliberate decisions. Real estate holdings, 3 properties I still own and manage through a property management company. Investment accounts diversified across asset classes, retirement funds, and the trust accounts. 3 of them, 1 for each grandchild, each funded at $300,000, structured to grow and compound until the beneficiaries reached 25 years of age. Caleb's trust, Zoe's trust, Jordan's trust, Renee's son, $900,000 in total, sitting in 3 protected accounts, watched over by Thomas Abernathy, untouchable without my written authorization and physical signature in his presence. That was the architecture. Now let me tell you about the architect. After Harold passed, I spent a year being what I needed to be: a grieving widow, a present grandmother, a steady mother to 2 adult children who were also losing their father and needed me to hold the shape of the family while they processed their own grief. I gave myself that year fully. I did not rush back to anything. But in the second year, I began to pay closer attention to the patterns around me. Specifically, I began to pay attention to Brittany. I want to be fair here. I did not begin watching Brittany because I disliked her. I began watching her because I am a woman who spent 35 years reading financial statements, and a financial statement will tell you the truth about an organization if you know where to look. People are not so different. If you know where to look, what someone consistently moves toward, what they quietly eliminate, how they respond when an obstacle appears, you begin to understand their actual priorities, regardless of what they say those priorities are. What I observed about Brittany over 24 months was this. She was building a structure. Systematically and patiently, she was rearranging the relationships inside Derek's life so that every significant decision eventually flowed through her. She managed access to Derek, to the children, to family events. She managed information. What Derek heard about his brother Calvin's calls, what he was told about my visits, how conversations were framed and reframed until the version she preferred became the version he believed. She managed resources, the household finances, the social calendar, the narrative they presented publicly on social media. She was not doing this clumsily. She was doing it with real skill. I recognized it because I had sat across from people in boardrooms who operated the same way. They didn't take things directly. They repositioned until the thing they wanted was simply, somehow, naturally, theirs. The trust funds were always the destination. I understood that by the time Derek came to ask his casual questions 3 months before the birthday party. What I didn't yet know was the specific plan, the house. That came later, from Calvin. Dorothy Freeman has been my best friend for 40 years, and I want you to know who she is, because she matters to this story in ways that go beyond what she did practically. She matters because of what she represents. The kind of friendship that tells you the truth, when truth is the last thing you feel ready to hear. Dot grew up in Memphis. She put herself through law school working nights at a hotel front desk and weekends at her aunt's catering business. She spent 22 years as a family court judge, which means she has seen, without exaggeration, the absolute worst that families are capable of doing to one another when money, inheritance, and resentment share a room. She retired 6 years ago. She now grows tomatoes, travels to new countries twice a year, and calls me every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock without fail. She was the first person I told when Harold's diagnosis came through. She was the one who flew to Atlanta and sat in my kitchen for 3 days after the funeral, not to talk, just to be present. She is the most honest person I have ever known, and her honesty has never once felt like cruelty, because it always comes wrapped in the specific kind of love that isn't afraid of the hard thing. About 16 months before Caleb's birthday party, I met Dot for coffee and told her what I'd been observing. All of it. The pattern of access control, the redirected conversations, the quiet financial questions from Derek, the phone call I'd partially overheard in the kitchen. Dot listened without interrupting. That itself told me she understood the seriousness, because Dot Freeman has opinions and she shares them readily. When she is quiet, she is thinking. Finally, she said, "Jane, you know what you're describing." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you need from me?" I told her, I needed her to help me think through worst-case legal scenarios. I needed her connections in the family law community. Specifically, who handled grandparent rights cases in Georgia with real success. And I needed someone who would be honest with me if I was overreacting. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "You are not overreacting." And I say that as someone who would absolutely tell you if you were. That was the beginning of our preparation. At my next meeting with Thomas Abernathy, the regular monthly meeting that Brittany didn't know occurred, I asked him to walk me through every legal vulnerability in the trust structures. Thomas pulled out the documents, and we spent 2 hours going through them with a level of attention that I suspect he usually reserves for clients facing active litigation. He was thorough. He identified every theoretical point of challenge and explained exactly how each one was already protected by the language he had drafted. Then he said something that has stayed with me. "Sylvia." Thomas occasionally calls me Sylvia when he is being particularly serious. "The most important protection in these documents is not any specific clause. It's the combination of you as sole trustee with full discretionary authority and the requirement for your in-person signature for any modification. That combination means that no one can do anything to these accounts through mail, through phone, through email, through a third party, or through a court filing without triggering a process that comes directly to me and requires your physical presence. As long as you are alive and competent, these accounts are, for all practical purposes, a closed door to everyone except you." I nodded. "And if someone were to argue that I'm not competent?" Thomas didn't flinch. He'd been expecting the question. "They would need a court order based on a formal competency evaluation. That process takes months, requires medical evidence, and can be challenged at every stage. I would be notified immediately of any such filing, and I would respond with the full resources of this firm on the same day." He paused. "But Jane, is there any basis for such an argument? Is there anything—" "No," I said, "there is not. I am asking because I want to understand what they might attempt." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I want you to know, I have been doing this for 30 years, and I can tell you that the scenario you're preparing for is one I have seen before, and the people who attempt it almost always underestimate the legal complexity. They think they're walking through an unlocked door. They don't realize the door is made of steel." I thanked him, shook his hand, and went home to my office. I opened my laptop. I opened the folder I had labeled with a date 16 months earlier, and I kept adding to it. The birthday party for Caleb's 7th year was on a Saturday in September. I was told, by text message, not by phone call, that I was welcome to come for the cake portion of the celebration. 3 o'clock, not before. I noted the guest list when I arrived. It consisted entirely of Brittany's family, Brittany's friends, and a handful of Caleb's school classmates. Calvin was not there. Derek's own brother, who lived 40 minutes away and had taken Caleb to his first baseball game. He had not been invited. Dot had not been invited, though Caleb called her Grandma Dot and asked for her banana pudding by name at every gathering. Renee was in Houston. I had not told her the details of what I was expecting. I didn't want her to fly in and escalate something before I understood the full shape of it. I arrived at 3 o'clock with a wrapped gift, a robotics building kit that Caleb had mentioned specifically and repeatedly for the past 2 months. I brought it because my grandson asked for it. Not to impress anyone, not to make a statement. Because a 7-year-old told his grandmother what he wanted for his birthday, and his grandmother listened. Brittany opened the door with her company smile, the bright, effortful one that doesn't reach the upper half of her face. "Right on time, Jane," she said, in the tone people use when they consider punctuality the minimum acceptable behavior rather than a courtesy. Caleb found me within 60 seconds of my arrival. He came running from the backyard with grass on his shoes and threw his arms around my waist. "Grandma Jane, you came! Did you bring the robot kit?" "It's on the table," I told him. "Happy birthday, my sweet boy." He dragged me towards the gift table with the full-body enthusiasm that only 7-year-olds possess, and for a few minutes, standing next to my grandson and watching his face as he tore into the wrapping paper, I forgot about everything else. His joy was completely genuine, a child experiencing exactly the gift he'd hoped for, surrounded by the uncomplicated happiness of a birthday. "It's the one with the lights, Grandma Jane. It's the exact one." "I know," I said, "because I listen when you talk." I held on to that moment. I knew what was coming next. 40 minutes after I arrived, Brittany touched my elbow and guided me toward the kitchen with the practiced smoothness of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. The party noise faded behind us. The kitchen was empty. She closed the door. Her smile was gone. "Jane, I want to be straightforward with you because I think you deserve that." Her arms crossed over her chest. Her voice was controlled. She'd prepared this, I could tell. "Derek and I have made some decisions about the direction of our family, and part of that involves the financial structure that currently exists around the children's accounts." I stood quietly. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. "Those trust funds," she continued, "were set up without our input. Caleb and Zoe are our children. We are their parents. It is not appropriate for you to be the sole decision-maker over accounts that belong to them, over money that will affect their lives. We've consulted with someone, and there is a clear legal path to restructuring the trustee arrangement. Derek is going to contact Thomas Abernathy on Monday to begin that process." She paused, waiting for me to react. I did not react. She pushed further. "I want you to understand that we're not doing this to be difficult. We're doing this because it's the right thing for our family. And I want you to consider cooperating voluntarily, because it will be much simpler for everyone, including your relationship with Caleb and Zoe, if this is handled without conflict." There it was. Not subtle. Not even trying to be subtle anymore. Cooperate, or lose access to your grandchildren. The threat was clean and direct, dressed up in the language of reason. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "I appreciate you being straightforward, Brittany." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She'd expected more resistance. The absence of it read to her as compliance. "I think we all just want what's best for the children," she added, her tone warming just enough to signal that she believed she had won. "Of course," I said. I turned and walked back to the party. I found Caleb, kissed the top of his head, told him I loved him, and that his robot was going to be magnificent. I found Derek in the corner of the living room. He was looking at the floor when I walked up. He did not meet my eyes. I stood next to my son for 10 seconds. He said nothing. I said nothing either. Then I walked to the front door, collected my purse and jacket, and left. In my car, I sat for exactly 2 minutes, not from indecision. I had made my decision before I walked out that door. I sat because I wanted to be certain my hands were steady. They were. I found Thomas Abernathy's name in my phone. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Thomas," I said, "I need you to freeze all 3 trust accounts immediately. Full lockdown. No withdrawals, no transfers, no trustee modification requests processed under any circumstances without my signature in your office. File the paperwork first thing Monday." A brief silence. Then, "Consider it done. I'll have the bank notified before close of business Monday and the protective filings submitted same day. Jane, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "I've been ready for this." I started the car and drove home. That evening, I called Renee. She answered on the first ring, the way she does when she already suspects something. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which tells you how serious she understood it to be, because Renee Washington does not stay quiet for long when she is hearing something that makes her blood pressure rise. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she said, "Mama, what do you need me to do?" I told her, "Right now, nothing. Just know and trust me." "I trust you," she said without hesitation. I've always trusted you. That night, after I spoke with Renee, I went into my office and opened the bottom drawer of my file cabinet, the one that requires a key. I took out a folder, not a thin one. Over the course of 18 months, I had been thorough. There were printed email records, including 3 emails Derek had sent to a real estate attorney, forwarded to me by Calvin, who had been copied accidentally on one and had understood immediately what he was looking at. There were dated notes from every conversation that had raised concern. There were records of the partial phone call I'd overheard, written down verbatim within 10 minutes of getting to my car. There were screenshots of Brittany's social media posts, the ones that, taken together, painted a picture of a woman obsessively focused on upgrading her visible lifestyle well beyond her household's actual income. And there was something else. A letter, handwritten, sealed in an envelope, addressed to Caleb Washington and marked, "Do not open until given to you by Thomas Abernathy." I had written that letter 4 months earlier, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the house was still and the garden was full of the late-season light that Harold always loved. I wrote it for Caleb to read when he was old enough to understand, not to explain the conflict, not to assign blame, but to tell him who his great-grandfather Harold was, and what it means to build something carefully, and why the money in his trust was never really about money. It was about the quiet account, the one you keep for the day when somebody tries to take something from you. I placed the letter back in the drawer. I placed the folder on my desk. I sat down in Harold's old chair. I moved it to my office years ago, and I looked at the photograph on the wall. The burgundy blazer, the conference table, the room full of people who had underestimated what was standing at the head of it. "There she is," Harold had said. I took a breath. There she is. 4 days after the birthday party, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Calvin, Derek's older brother, 48 years old, a man who has always been straightforward to the point of occasional bluntness, which I have always appreciated. "Aunt Jane," he said. He has called me that since he was a teenager, even though I'm his mother-in-law's age, not his aunt. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm telling you because I love my brother and I love those kids." "Tell me," I said. "Derek called me last week and asked if I knew anything about your accounts. Not just the trusts, your personal accounts. He asked if I knew which bank you used, whether you had a financial advisor, whether you'd ever mentioned updating your will." I was quiet for a moment. He didn't sound like himself, Aunt Jane. He sounded like he was reading from a list. After we hung up, I sat with that information for a long time, because there is a difference between a wife who manipulates and a husband who follows, and a husband who begins to actively investigate. Derek had not merely gone along with Brittany's plan. He had become a participant in it. That was the moment I understood. This was not a situation I could resolve through a family conversation or an appeal to my son's better instincts. This required the full architecture of everything I had prepared. I called Thomas. "Move the timeline up," I said. "I want everything in place by end of this week." "Already done," Thomas said. The accounts were frozen as of Monday morning. "But Jane, there's something you should know. Someone called the bank yesterday. A woman. She identified herself as having power of attorney and requested account information for the trust funds. The bank followed protocol and refused, then flagged it and called me." I closed my eyes briefly. Brittany. The name given was a variation, but yes. The bank manager said she became, his word was aggressive, when the request was denied. I thanked Thomas and ended the call. I opened my desk drawer and added a new dated entry to the folder. Then I called Dorothy Freeman. "Dot," I said. "It's time. I need the name of the best family law attorney in Atlanta." Dot said, "I've had 3 names ready for you for 6 months. I'll text them right now." She did. Within 30 seconds, 3 names arrived on my phone. I looked at them carefully. Then I picked up the phone and made an appointment. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks away. I chose what to wear 4 days in advance. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks between the birthday party and the Thursday morning meeting, because those 3 weeks are the part of this story that nobody saw. Not Brittany, not Derek, not even Renee, not fully. While Brittany was planning her next move, I was making mine. And the difference between our 2 sets of preparations was the difference between someone who believes they are the smartest person in a room they have never actually studied, and someone who has spent 18 months learning every corner of that room in the dark. The Monday after the birthday party, Thomas filed the protective documentation with the bank. All 3 trust accounts, Caleb's, Zoe's, Jordan's, were locked with a secondary security layer that required my physical presence, government-issued identification, and witnessed signature before any transaction, modification, or trustee inquiry could be processed. The bank's fraud department was notified of the attempted false power of attorney claim. That notification created a formal record, Thomas said with his particular brand of quiet satisfaction. If anyone attempts to contact this bank regarding these accounts again without your authorization, they will be speaking directly with our legal department, not a branch manager. That was Monday. On Wednesday, I met with Patricia Okafor. I had chosen her from Dot's list of 3 names. Patricia was 55 years old, a partner at a mid-size Atlanta firm specializing in estate litigation and family law. Dot had clerked with her years ago and described her as the kind of attorney who does not raise her voice because she has never needed to. Patricia and I spent 2 hours together. I brought the folder. All of it. 18 months of documentation, organized chronologically and by category. She read through it without speaking, making occasional small notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she set the folder down, folded her hands on her desk, and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as professional respect. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "this is one of the most thoroughly prepared client files I have received in 30 years of practice. Most people come to me after the damage is done. You are here before the final move has been made." "I would like to keep it that way," I said. We discussed strategy for the remainder of the meeting. Patricia outlined the legal landscape clearly. The trust documents were ironclad. There was no legitimate path for Derek and Brittany to force a trustee change without my consent. The attempted false power of attorney claim at the bank was a serious matter, potentially criminal, depending on what documentation Brittany had actually presented. And my documented evidence of ongoing coercion and the threat to withhold grandchild access was directly relevant to a potential grandparent visitation rights filing if it came to that. "What is your desired outcome?" Patricia asked. "Not legally, personally." I thought about that for a moment. I want my grandchildren's futures protected. I want my son to have a real choice, not one that's been arranged for him by someone else. And I want it clearly understood, by everyone involved, that I am not a woman who can be managed. Patricia wrote something on her legal pad. Then she looked up. "Then here is what I recommend we do." While I was meeting with Patricia on that Wednesday, Brittany was doing something of her own. I know this because Thomas told me afterward, and because the bank manager, who had by this point developed a personal investment in the situation, called Thomas directly when it happened. Brittany went to the bank branch in person. She brought a document that she claimed was a power of attorney granting her authority to act on behalf of Jane Washington in financial matters. The document had my name on it. It had a notary seal on it. I had never signed such a document. I had never met the notary whose seal appeared on it. The bank manager, following the fraud alert protocol Thomas had established, politely declined to process any request and asked Brittany to leave her contact information for follow-up. Brittany refused to leave contact information. She became, according to the manager's written account, visibly agitated and made several statements suggesting that the account holder was not fully capable of managing her own affairs. She left without getting what she came for. Thomas called me that evening. He read me the bank manager's written account word for word. When he finished, I said, "Thomas, I need you to preserve every piece of that documentation. The manager's account, the security footage request, everything." "Already in process," he said. "And Thomas, I'd like you to schedule a meeting, a formal one at your office. Invite Derek and Brittany. Tell them you're prepared to discuss the trustee modification request in a structured legal setting. Give them a week's notice." A pause. "And what will actually happen at that meeting?" "Justice," I said. "The quiet kind. I need to tell you what was happening on their side of these 3 weeks, because the contrast matters." After the birthday party, Brittany told Derek that his conversation with me had gone, in her words, better than expected. She told him I had seemed receptive. She told him that the path forward was clear, and that by the time they sat down with Thomas Abernathy, the transfer of trustee authority would be a formality. Derek, from what Calvin later told me, did not ask many questions. He was focused, intensely, desperately focused, on the house. The property they had identified was in a gated neighborhood with excellent schools and the kind of address that Brittany had wanted for years. They had made an offer. The offer had been accepted contingent on financing. The down payment they needed was $180,000. They did not have $180,000, but they believed They had convinced themselves entirely that they were about to. Brittany posted on social media during those 3 weeks. I did not follow her accounts, but Renee did. And Renee read me the posts over the phone with a tone in her voice that moved between fury and disbelief. There were hints about exciting changes, photographs of the neighborhood taken through a car window, a post about building the life your children deserve. 847 likes on one of them. Comments from friends saying, "So excited for you," and "You deserve this." The morning Thomas's meeting invitation arrived in Derek's email, Brittany called her sister to say that things were moving forward. Calvin, who happened to be having lunch with Derek's colleague that same day, heard secondhand that Derek seemed lighter than he'd been in months. They were certain. They were walking toward a room they believed was unlocked. They did not know that I was already inside it. Thomas Abernathy's office is on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta. The conference room looks out over a stand of oak trees that have been there longer than the building. It is a room designed to communicate permanence. Solid table, leather chairs, clean surfaces, nothing decorative except a single framed photograph of the Atlanta skyline at dawn. I arrived 30 minutes early. I was not wearing the gray cardigan. I wore a navy suit that I have kept in my closet for 12 years, worn only to occasions that require the full version of who I am. It fits exactly as it did when I bought it. My hair was pinned up. My shoes had a modest heel. I carried a leather portfolio that Harold gave me on my last day at Hargrove, engraved with my initials and the date. Patricia Okafor arrived at the same time by prior arrangement. She set her own portfolio on the table, substantial, organized, the physical weight of preparation. Thomas greeted us both and offered coffee. We accepted. We sat. The three of us were quiet for a moment in the particular way of people who are prepared and do not need to fill silence with nervous conversation. At 10 o'clock exactly, the conference room door opened. Derek came in first. He was wearing a jacket over an open-collared shirt. He had dressed up, but not completely. His face was composed in the specific way of someone who is working to appear confident and not quite succeeding. Behind him, Brittany. She wore a tailored blazer. Her hair was perfect. She carried a leather folder of her own and was accompanied by a man in his late 30s whom she introduced as our family attorney. I noted the attorney. I had expected him. Patricia had prepared accordingly. They sat down across the table. Brittany's eyes moved to Patricia, a flicker of recalibration, then to Thomas, then to the portfolio in front of me, then finally to me. I watched the moment she registered what she was actually looking at. Not the grandmother from the corner chair. Not the woman in the gray cardigan who accepted sweet tea graciously and asked no difficult questions. Not the woman whose silence in that kitchen she had mistaken for surrender. The woman in the navy suit. The woman with the leather portfolio engraved with initials. The woman who had arrived 30 minutes early and was sitting at the head of her own situation with complete stillness. Brittany's expression did not collapse. She was too controlled for that. But something shifted. A tightening around the eyes. A fraction of reconsideration. Derek was looking at me differently. He was looking at me the way you look at something familiar when you suddenly cannot remember why you stopped paying attention to it. Thomas opened the meeting in his professional and unhurried way, establishing the purpose and the parties present. Then he turned the floor to Patricia. Patricia spoke for 9 minutes without raising her voice once. She outlined the trust structures and their legal protections. She outlined the basis on which any trustee modification request would be evaluated, and the basis on which the current request had been denied. She outlined the documented attempts to access the accounts through unauthorized means, including the specific incident at the bank branch, including the document bearing my name that I had never signed. She set a copy of the bank manager's written account in the center of the table. Brittany's attorney leaned forward to read it. His expression did not change, but his pen stopped moving. Patricia then set down a second document, Thomas's log of every phone call and contact attempt made to his office by Derek and Brittany over the preceding 6 weeks. Then a third document, dated notes from my own records, compiled over 18 months. "Mrs. Washington has been thorough," Patricia said, which was perhaps the most understated sentence spoken in that room that morning. Brittany's attorney said something quietly to Brittany. Brittany's jaw tightened. Then I opened my portfolio. I took out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table in front of me. I folded my hands. I looked across at my son and his wife. Derek's eyes were fixed on me. He had not looked at Brittany in the last 4 minutes. I said, I have been in this room, or rooms like it, for 35 years. I want you to understand something clearly. I did not come here today to punish anyone. I came here because my grandchildren's futures required me to be here, and I have never once failed to show up for what my family requires. I paused, just long enough. Brittany, you told me in your kitchen that I was no longer needed, that you had made your decisions, that the trust funds belong to your family now. She said nothing. I want to tell you something that I should perhaps have told you much earlier. I am not the woman you decided I was. I am the woman who built these accounts, who protected them, and who has documented every attempt to circumvent that protection. I know about the house. I know about the down payment. I know what those funds were intended to be used for. Derek made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes out when something lands. And I want you to hear this clearly, Derek, because you are my son and I need you to understand. I turned to face him fully. Those accounts hold $900,000 that belongs to Caleb, Zoe, and Jordan. Not to you, not to me, to them. When they are 25 years old and ready to begin their adult lives, that money will still be there on those days. I promise you that, and I have never broken a promise to my children. The room was completely silent. Now, here is what happens next. I had written the conditions out the night before in longhand on the same notepad I have used for important documents for 20 years. I did not read from the paper. I knew them by heart. But the paper was there because documentation matters. The first condition. The trust funds for Caleb, Zoe, and Jordan remain exactly as structured. I remain sole trustee for all 3 accounts. No modification requests will be entertained, filed, or discussed under any circumstances. When each grandchild reaches 25, the funds will be released to them directly, as designed. This is not a negotiating point. The second condition. Any further attempt to access, modify, or legally challenge the trust structures, through the bank, through a court filing, through any third party, will result in the documentation of fraudulent power of attorney being immediately forwarded to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. Patricia had been clear with me that the bank incident was a prosecutable matter. I was not bluffing. Brittany's attorney knew I was not bluffing. The third condition. My access to Caleb and Zoe would be normalized. 2 visits per month, minimum, without advance permission requirements, without conditions, without Brittany present if she chose not to be. If that access was interfered with in any way, I would file for formal grandparent visitation rights in family court, supported by the full documentation of financial coercion and the pattern of isolation already on record. These are not punishments, I said when I had finished. They are simply the structure that now exists. Anyone who chooses to work within it will find that I am exactly the same person I have always been, present, supportive, and genuinely invested in this family's well-being. Brittany's attorney leaned over and spoke to her in a low voice for about 30 seconds. She was rigid beside him. Her folder was still closed. Then she stood up. "This isn't over," she said. "Yes, it is," I said, quietly, without anger. "It was over before you walked in." She walked out. Her attorney followed, pausing only to exchange a look with Patricia that communicated clearly that he would be advising his client in a different direction going forward. Derek did not move. He sat across from me in the sudden quiet of that room, and he looked like a man who had just been handed a mirror he'd been avoiding for a very long time. Thomas and Patricia gave us the room. Derek and I sat across from each other in the conference room overlooking the oak trees. The city moved quietly 14 floors below us. He didn't speak for a long time. I let the silence stand. I have learned over 68 years that the most important things people have to say usually come out in the spaces between words, if you give those spaces enough room. Finally, he said, "How long have you known?" 18 months, I said. "Give or take." He closed his eyes briefly. "And you didn't say anything." I waited until I understood the full picture, and until you had made your own choices clearly enough that neither of us could pretend otherwise. He looked at the table. Mom, the kitchen, at Caleb's party, when I walked in and didn't. "I know," I said. "I should have." "Derek," I kept my voice even. "I am not going to tell you what you should have done. You already know." He was quiet again. Then, and I watched it happen, the slow fracturing of something he'd been holding rigid for a long time. His shoulders dropped. Not in defeat, in exhaustion. the kind that comes when you stop carrying something that was never yours to carry. She told me you were trying to control us, he said. She said the money was always about power, that you'd never let us be independent. And did that match what you knew of me? I asked. From before? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I gave you and Brittany over $100,000 across 7 years, Derek. Never asked for a cent back. Never held it over you. Never attached conditions. Does that sound like someone who uses money to control people? No, he said, very quietly. The trust funds are not about control. They are about those children having something real waiting for them when they are adults. Because your father and I built something real, and we wanted to pass that forward. That is all it has ever been. Derek looked up at me, and for the first time in years, maybe the first time since before Harold got sick, since before the slow drift that Brittany had engineered so skillfully, I saw my son's face without the particular tension that had become so habitual I'd almost stopped seeing it. Mom, he said, I think I need help. I know, I said. And I am right here. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We stayed like that for a while in the quiet room, above the oak trees. The months that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because this is a true story, and true stories do not resolve cleanly the way we sometimes wish they would. Derek and Brittany separated 8 weeks after the meeting. It was Derek who initiated it. He told me later that the meeting had been a kind of breaking point, not because of the legal proceedings, but because sitting in that room and seeing me clearly, and seeing himself clearly in contrast, had made it impossible to continue pretending that he didn't know what he knew. Brittany contested many things. She was angry, and some of her anger was the genuine grief of a marriage ending, which I respected even while I did not soften the conditions I had set. Her attorney, to his credit, advised her consistently and correctly that the legal position she was fighting from was not strong. The divorce took 7 months. Joint custody of Caleb and Zoe was established. Derek with the majority of time initially, as he had more stable housing. The family court judge, reviewing the full record, made note of the documented financial coercion in her written decision. Brittany returned to work. The house they had wanted was purchased by someone else. Calvin came to dinner at my house 3 weeks after the meeting. He sat at my kitchen table and ate 2 helpings of everything and said very little, which is Calvin's way of saying a great deal. Renee flew in from Houston the month after. She and Derek sat on my back porch for 3 hours one evening while I watched through the kitchen window, 2 siblings finding their way back to each other across the distance that had been carefully constructed between them. I did not interrupt. Some things need to happen without an audience. And Dot came over on a Tuesday afternoon with her banana pudding, and we sat in the garden and talked for 4 hours about Harold, and about our mothers, and about what it means to have built something that lasts. 6 months after the Thursday meeting, on a warm Saturday in March, I had Caleb and Zoe and Jordan at my house for the afternoon. Caleb had brought his robotics kit, the one from his birthday, now assembled and modified and added to with pieces he'd saved his allowance to buy. He set it up on the garden table with the focused attention of someone who takes his work seriously, which he does, at 7 years old, in the way that tells you exactly who a person is going to become. Jordan sat beside him, 10 years old and patient in the way of a child who has always preferred understanding to rushing. He was showing Caleb how to adjust the wheel calibration. Zoe was in the garden, collecting flowers that she was arranging into a bouquet for no one in particular, which is its own kind of art. I brought out lemonade and sat down on the garden bench. Caleb looked up from the robot. He had a small grease mark on his chin from the gears, which I decided not to mention. "Grandma Jane," he said, "did you know that the person who builds something can always fix it if it breaks? Because they know how all the parts work." I looked at my grandson. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. He shrugged with the magnificent casualness of a child who collects wisdom without tracking its sources. "I just figured it out," I smiled. "You figured it out right." He went back to his robot. Jordan looked up at me briefly with his mother's eyes, perceptive, quiet, seeing more than he lets on, and then went back to the calibration. I sat in Harold's garden in the March light, watching 3 children who would one day be adults with resources and choices and real foundations waiting for them, and I thought about my mother's kitchen table on Friday nights, the envelope system, the careful allocation, the quiet account, the one you keep for the day when somebody tries to take something from you. I had kept it. I had used it exactly as she intended. And sitting in that garden, With Zoe's mismatched bouquet and Caleb's mechanical precision and Jordan's steady patience, I understood that everything I had protected was already becoming what it was meant to be. I want to say something to you directly now, if you'll let me. I am 68 years old. I grew up in Birmingham in the 1950s and 60s, which means I grew up understanding something that not everyone has had to learn the same way, that what you have built can be taken from you if you are not paying attention, and sometimes even if you are. That being overlooked is not the same as being without power. That quiet is a strategy, not a weakness. My mother taught me that. Harold lived it. I have tried to carry both of them forward in the way I move through the world. When Brittany looked at me in that kitchen and saw a woman she could manage, I was not offended. I was clarified. Because in that moment she told me everything I needed to know about how this situation would unfold, and I had already prepared for it. The trust funds will be there when Caleb is 25. They will be there when Zoe is 25. They will be there when Jordan is 25. Not because I am rigid or controlling, but because a promise made to the future deserves to be kept, and I am a woman who keeps her promises. To every woman watching this who has ever been spoken over, managed, underestimated, or quietly moved to the corner of a room that she helped build, I want you to hear this. Being overlooked is information. Use it. Prepare in the silence they give you. Document what matters. Trust the people who have shown you, over decades and not just days, that they deserve your trust. And when the moment comes, and it will come, walk into that room in your navy suit and let them see, clearly and without drama, exactly who they have been underestimating. I am 68 years old. I have worked for everything I have. I have loved my family imperfectly and genuinely, and with full commitment. And I sat in a corner for 3 years while someone built a plan around my silence. They spent years looking past me. I used that time well.